Welcome back, everybody. This is our Unit 1 review for art appreciation. Things to know for the test, concepts to be aware of. The way I've set the test up is going to require you to understand these concepts and then apply them in making decisions about classifying different pieces of art. So you'll look at a picture, for instance, and it'll ask you to decide which role of the artist is being fulfilled by the particular piece. So we'll practice a little bit with that toward the end. So just to refresh your memory, the roles of the artist that we've looked at over the course of Unit 1, and these are very, very broad. Remember that things could get much more specific than this. We tried to give you the most broad cases possible. First role would be simply recording the world. So something perhaps like a landscape or an anatomical study of a person or an animal. Number two, giving form to ideas or feelings, trying to create an image that expresses a deep personal emotion like fear or anger or sadness. Number three, revealing the unknown. This is a difficult one for some of us. Revealing the unknown doesn't mean that we're showing something that doesn't exist necessarily, but something that is not a common experience for most people. So for instance, hopefully none of us will find out, but we're still alive. We haven't gone to the next life. No one knows what hell might look like. Hopefully we get to find out what heaven looks like or some other positive outcome, but you don't know for sure. So an artist could help you imagine or depict what that might possibly be. Number four is also really important for us. It's showing the world in an innovative way, showing us the world in a way that we don't already assume it to be, showing us something different and new and unique. This is a really important and critical one, I think, for artists today, to be imagining what a possible future could look like, to show us a different way of thinking about the world. All of those kinds of aspects fall under this role of the artist, helping us see the world in an innovative way. Remember definitely that art is artificial. It is made with intention. It is made usually to communicate some kind of idea, even if that idea is hard to put into words. It may be a purely visual idea or a more emotional idea. Most of the artwork that we'll look at this semester is very much made by human beings with definite intention. Even if it looks sloppy, even if it looks abstract, the images that you're looking at were made for a reason. They were made by people with a point of view. We also talked about three very common misconceptions about art, things that people assume. My personal favorite is that art has to be pretty, that all art must be beautiful. Not every aspect of life is beautiful, and art is about our experiences and our communication about those experiences. Some art depicts ugly things. Some aspects of life aren't pretty. So remember that art being beautiful is not a criteria. There's definitely art that deals with things that are not quote-unquote pretty. We also think sometimes about great art, like the stuff that gets into the textbook or that gets selected for purchase to be displayed in a museum, that those kind of masterpieces are only possible from people who have this official art world connection or art world training, and certainly that's not the case. We've seen art that has moved us made by people who don't have art world training. We also have this last point that artists are born, they're not made, that somehow artists have this magical talent that's just bestowed upon them at birth, and everything they make is just perfect. That's really not true. There are a lot of cases of artists who struggled for a long time to achieve anything approaching what they thought was good. Vincent van Gogh would be a great example of someone whose drawings, even in his own opinion, but certainly the opinion of other people who saw them at the time that he was starting out, were not considered to be particularly very good. In fact, at one point in his career, he was given the advice to join a remedial class for children. It was aimed at kids. That's how bad they thought his drawing was. So really, yeah, there's talent. That's an issue. There's certainly a propensity that people have toward being good at certain things. You might be born with a propensity or a likelihood that you might be good at a particular sport, but that doesn't make you automatically great. You still have to put in the effort to achieve greatness. Some difficult terms that we want to think about for the purposes of the test, but more importantly, for communicating clearly with each other about art. And we did this with our discussion board. The concept of form. When we're talking about formal issues or issues of form, try to keep your thinking very formal. We're not making emotional decisions. We're not talking about the meaning or the emotional content of a piece of work. Form is just about how the thing looks. So anything that you could state about the appearance that doesn't go into the territory of meaning or interpretation. Form could have everything to do with the size of the piece, whether it's black and white, is it two-dimensional or three-dimensional? Is it smooth texture or does it have a very rough texture? Those are all issues of form. Content is where we start to get into the issues of meaning. So think of content as what the art contains. And it contains really two things. Subject matter. The subject is just what's being depicted, what is being shown to you. If you're thinking about diagramming a sentence or identifying the parts of speech in a sentence, the subject is the noun. So if I say the naughty dog barks too much, the subject, the noun in the sentence is dog. The naughtiness and the tendency for the dog to bark are my subjective emotional reactions. They're not the subject. The subject is purely what is being talked about, in this case, the dog. Meaning, theme, message. Again, if I use that sentence, the naughty dog barks too much, then that implies that the message I'm trying to get across is my neighbor's dog barks and it drives me crazy, which is true. But the bigger picture here is that the person making the thing has a meaning or a message they might communicate, and you, the receiver, the person seeing the art, might have a completely different interpretation. So remember that with the meaning and message, we have to always think about what is it the artist intends us to get, and then what do we get personally based on our own experiences? Because those things don't always match up exactly. We definitely talked about the idea of iconography. Iconography really is visual symbolism. The idea here is that in a painting or a sculpture, you might see a depiction or a symbol that has a very specific meaning, but unless you're part of that culture, or unless you have studied about that culture, you might not automatically understand what meaning is. Just the color green for the dress, in this case, is meant to imply fertility, but you might not automatically get that without some studying. So remember, you really need to either be part of the culture, in which case you probably get the idea automatically, or you have to have studied or learned something about it in order to interpret these kinds of iconographic symbols. We definitely look at the term style. We use this word all the time, and we pretty much mean the same thing in visual art that we mean when we use this term in pop culture. Style is a way that we can help define or group things that are similar to one another. You could very easily list out musical performers and group them by which of the performers have a style that's more in common. Certainly, if I gave you Lil Wayne, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, one of them is clearly different from the other two in terms of style, right? So when you think about style, you're trying to think in terms of what this grouping of objects have in common. So you might be able to talk about a style that applies to an entire culture. The ancient Egyptians, for example, that culture existed for well over 3,000 years without a significant long-term major change in the way the art was being made. All the way from the examples of sculpture and painting around the time of the pyramids, really up until the generations immediately after King Tut, the style stays essentially the same for thousands of years, style of an entire culture. We could get more specific. Within a culture, we could look at art of a specific time period. The Italian Renaissance would be a great example of a period of roughly 200 years where most artists in that culture had very similar goals. Their artwork had a certain appearance, certain things they had in common, the art of a time period. But within a time period, you could get even more specific. In the 1800s, roughly around the years 1860 to 1890, there was a group of painters working with very similar goals that you've heard of, the French Impressionists. They painted from direct observation with very obvious brushstrokes, not a ton of detail for the most part. They painted their impression of light and color from observation. That was a group of artists, similar approaches. You could also talk very specifically within a culture, within a time period, even within a group. An individual artist usually has his or her own style that sets them apart, that's unique from the work of other people. Even within that, you could get more specific. Some artists, not all, but some artists really change their style pretty radically from project to project or from time period to time period. You've certainly heard this in the music industry. Sometimes a performer might start out, say, sounding more like a country style and goes into more of a pop style. Taylor Swift, I guess you could argue, was kind of country at one point and is definitely more pop now. How about Pablo Picasso as a visual example, an artist who changes? He did at least 9 different major style shifts during his very, very long career. So again, the style is not necessarily about the subjects that people are painting or the content or the meaning. It's about the visual appearance, ultimately, of the work. We definitely wanted to spend some time looking at this slide because a lot of the questions on your test, I've set the test up to be open book, open notes, so you could even have this pulled up on a laptop while you're working. The image that you're looking at here helps you to think about how to categorize visual artwork. If you think of it kind of as a sliding scale, then pretty much any piece of work we analyze could be put into this little chart. What you're looking at, for the most part, almost always, you're going to be looking at artwork that could be categorized as representational, art that represents something in the real world. And I mean that very literally, that the majority of what you're going to see will fit that category. Now, when we talk representational work, that means when you look at it without even looking at the title, you should be able to recognize what the subject is, even if it is presented to you in a kind of stranger or less quote-unquote realistic way. These are 3 paintings on the screen. Even the image on the far left that you would at first glance think might be a black and white photograph was actually painted. So that's clearly a representation of a human being. The image in the middle is very abstract. It's very altered from the way we expect people to look, and yet you can recognize there's a human being in there. That's definitely representational. But the image at the far right does not in any way attempt to represent something from the real world. So when we get to that level, that's usually what people think of when we use the term abstract, but really a better term there is non-objective or non-representational art that isn't intending to represent something from the real world. Within the realm of things that are representational, some things will look more like the natural world, and some things are going to look like they've been changed or altered from what we expect to see. The more it looks like what you expect objective reality to look like, the more naturalistic it is. A lot of us use the term realistic, and that would be fine, except that there is a style of painting in France in the 1850s called realism with a capital R. So to make sure that I'm not time-locking my discussion to only the artwork of French painters of the 1850s, I want to make sure everybody's very clear on this, talking about The more the thing looks like nature, the more it looks like the natural world, the more it looks like what you expect things to look like. If it looks photographically real, the more naturalistic it is. The less so, that means that things have been changed in some way. That might mean that details have been deleted. It might mean that some things have been simplified. It might mean that other things have been exaggerated or amplified. All of those changes from reality are what we refer to as abstractions, changing from the way we expect things to appear. So within the spectrum of representational work, you really have a broad spectrum there. You have things that look almost exactly like photographs, the most naturalistic, most extremely real-looking things you can imagine, toward things that are very, very, very abstract on the other end of that spectrum, things that have definitely been changed or abstracted. We also talked a bit about this idea of the conventions of representation, the way that a culture chooses to present itself. In the case of the ancient Greeks, you have two sculptures there by two different artists made at two different times, and they look like they could be the exact same person, and they're not meant to be at all. They're actually meant to be two completely different people. But the Greeks had a standard way of representing human beings. It looks very natural to us. The muscles and bones and tendons and things look pretty believable, but at the same time they were presenting kind of an ideal version of what a human being would look like. Each culture that we look at tends to have certain standards of beauty or standards of the way that the images of human beings are presented to you. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, had a very specific system of proportions and a way of presenting the body. If you think of ancient Egyptian art, very often you see the face in profile, but the torso turned as if the figure's looking towards you, and then the legs turned again into profile, at least with Egyptian relief sculpture and two-dimensional painting and so forth. In those cases, you're looking at Egyptian conventions of representation. There was a standard kind of format for how they presented reality to you. There's an Egyptian example right there. In this case, you can really clearly see the head's in profile, the torso towards you, the legs are in profile. We sometimes refer to that as the composite view because it combines, or is a composite of three different points of view at once. We've spent a lot of time talking about themes of art, and I class them into two broad groups: themes that apply to typical people's lives, and then to things that aren't just about us personally, but about us in groups, things that we could look at as the relationship between art and society. So within your themes, and again, these are very broad, and we could get much more picky and specific within each one, but I gave you some broad ones here for themes that relate to people's lives. We've got the natural world, your daily life, imagination, and then key events in life, as opposed to everyday events, really key events like birth and death, the big ticket items, so to speak. We also want to remember that we talked about the difference between things that are purely utilitarian, things that are functional, versus things that have an aesthetic appeal. Generally speaking, art tends to have no practical function. It has an aesthetic function. So within our themes, the natural world, a good example might be something like a landscape or an image that depicts an animal. Images of daily life are images that don't show you like big, important political or religious events. It could be something as simple as a picture of someone drinking a cup of coffee or going to work or school. These daily events, entertainment, sports, things to do in the house, those all could go into the daily life category. We even have a specific term in visual art that you want to remember for the purpose of the test: genre scene, G-E-N-R-E. We use that term very differently in visual art than we use it anywhere else. For us, genre always means a scene of daily life. In the context of visual art, genre means a scene of daily life. Your imagination theme is pretty broad. That could show us all kinds of things that we have to use our imagination to figure out what they might look like. Images of nightmares, images of monsters. Technically, you could even say some religious images would require an artist to use their imagination to think of what those things might look like. A depiction of hell, for instance, would require your imagining what it might be like. Birth and death are your two really huge topics that we see a lot in visual art, but I don't want to classify them with daily life events because they don't happen to you every single day. Those are really big, momentous moments. So hugely important, deserve their own category, and there are some specific terms there as well. The term vanitas is important for us. It's a particular type of still life. A still life painting is a painting that isn't a landscape. It's not a portrait. There's no people. Usually there's no living things in a still life at all. A still life is usually a grouping of objects on a surface like a tabletop. Vanitas still life is a particular type of still life that became very popular in the Dutch Baroque, roughly the 1600s in Holland. And during that period, people decorated their homes with lots of different types of art, but one very popular subject was the vanitas subject. It was a still life that showed things from your day-to-day existence. It probably would include some reference to food, something to drink. Often would include things like flowers, ripe fruit, that type of thing could be depicted as well. But very often the vanitas also included a reminder that life is temporary. A memento mori literally is a reminder of death. So sometimes these images would even include a skull. That's the best example of a memento mori, although there could be others. It could be, for instance, an hourglass suggesting the passage of time. The point of the vanitas still life was not to scare you or to be morbid or to be sad. It was more to suggest the idea that life is brief, so you should enjoy it and you should enjoy your senses, but you shouldn't go too far down the road of sin or gluttony because your soul is on the line. You're here for a brief time. You don't want to run against God, for instance. Themes that we looked at in art that relates to how we interact with each other on a social level include art about religion and art about politics. So, of course, religion has been a fundamental subject for us all the way back to some of the discussion we had about the art in the ancient caves. The prehistoric cave paintings might have had a religious function. We certainly saw religious imagery when we were talking about the code of laws with King Hammurabi. We saw that he was given the right to be the king. In his view, that right was given to him by a god. So we've certainly seen religious imagery in lots of different ways. Think of it as a way of helping people to understand religious ideas, particularly for people who have access to or were unable to read religious texts. Most people in the Middle Ages, for instance, although they were practicing Christians, would not have been able to read the Bible because they couldn't read at all. And so religious images became really important in helping to communicate the idea of those various stories and lessons. Within the work that we could theme as very political, you could certainly make an argument that you could divide political art into two huge groups. One, politically themed art that supports a given power base or a given idea. And then you could also categorize another section of politically themed art being art of protest, or art that cries out against a perceived injustice or is against a perceived power base that needs to be challenged. So political art can definitely be made either within the power structure, in which case you might consider it propaganda to sort, and it could be certainly made outside of a power base, kind of calling attention to or protesting something that exists. Definitely want to remember 4 key pieces of art, or 4 key artists. We talked about politically themed art that brought up the subject of art that has caused public controversy over time. So I just want you to be aware of a couple of important artists and some key works. So there are a handful of questions toward the end of the test that will ask you to identify the type of art that caused controversy and associate it with the artist that that controversy was about. So one artist that we looked at, of course, was the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, and we talked about the controversy created around the artwork that was shown in a retrospective after he passed away. And the controversy, of course, was that people were concerned about the sexually themed images, and there was even a court case about whether the artwork itself was pornographic or not. And one of the key arguments against seeing the work as just pornography was thinking about the context of the, did it have a relevant social, historical, cultural, or even scientific reason for its creation or its existence, and also considering the work as a whole, as opposed to just looking at one individual image, looking at his entire body of work. That brings us then to another artist who definitely caused some controversy with this piece. What you're seeing here is The Tilted Arc by Richard Serra. This was a controversy because it was publicly funded. The office building was a federal building, so federal funds went to the Percent for Art Fund, which funded the selection and installation of this public sculpture. And some people loved it, some people hated it. It was removed at night on a weekend to try to lower the controversy. We definitely looked at a pretty controversial piece. It may seem less controversial to you than the Mapplethorpe work, but this also centered on nudity in art. This was a painting by Manet called Luncheon on the Grass, the English translation, and it was rejected from the official art exhibition in Paris in 1863. One of the issues behind its rejection was that people were shocked to see semi-clad and nude women with fully clothed men in what seemed to be contemporary clothing, and probably a leisure space outside of Paris, maybe a park or a nature preserve. So it seemed shocking to people. And we know, of course, that Manet based the composition on a design that was done by Raphael that depicted gods sitting in this exact pose. We also know that he was kind of calling back to earlier Renaissance examples in which nude female figures with clothed male were presented. They were considered acceptable because theoretically the women were mythological muses inspiring the men. Here they don't have that kind of veneer. So really Manet was kind of calling us out for being hypocritical about accepting nudity in some contexts and not in others. We definitely looked at this piece, which seems odd to me that it would cause a controversy at all. It's a pretty cool painting of the reflections of smoke and light as fireworks are shot off over the Thames River in London. But the controversy was not so much about the subject, it was about the way that the critic, John Ruskin, wrote about the piece. And he wrote a really scathing review, which of course was published, and it very nearly could have destroyed Whistler's career. Whistler sued him for libel, which is basically slander in written form. If you published something intentionally trying to destroy someone's career, that would be considered libel. And so in this case, Whistler actually won the libel suit. It was kind of a remarkable court case of its time. And it is a turning point in art because really Ruskin's opinion had a lot of power behind it. He was a very respected art critic, and he was very much opposed to these new trends in art. Whistler could be classified somewhat loosely as an impressionist painter. And so that's kind of interesting to think about a style that we now take for granted as something beautiful that we love was at the time that it was created considered dangerous. So that brings us to a great example of an impressionist painting. Now that doesn't seem dangerous to me at all. That could be a very safe painting that you could get as a reproduction, as a poster, or you could see that in your dentist's office or something very similar to it, and you would never think of that as being controversial. But this is an impressionist style painting as well. I put in some examples here at the end just to give you a taste of what some of the questions on the test are like. What if you were presented with this painting and I asked the question quite directly, is it representational or is it non-objective? Obviously, this is meant to represent sky, clouds, trees, grass. We can recognize what the subject is. This would be representational. If I were to ask you whether you could classify this as naturalistic, as extremely abstract, or as totally non-representational, I think you could argue quite easily this is a naturalistic image. It looks like the way we expect the world to look. The sky is blue, the grass is green. If I asked you for the theme, and normally with these questions I won't give you all of the themes that we discuss. I try to narrow them so it becomes more obvious which one we're really going for. But this would be hard to argue as a theme that had a political statement behind it, for instance. It would also be kind of hard to argue that this was necessarily an image about birth or death. But if the option included the natural world, that'd be a great theme for this one. There's very little evidence of human beings here at all. It looks very much like a painting just of nature. Again, if I were to ask you the role of the artist, I would limit the choices so that there would be no ambiguity. But does this reveal something unknown? I think that's kind of hard to argue that it reveals the unknown. We've all seen grass and trees. This feels like the real world. Does it record the world? Absolutely it does. It looks just like what we think the world looks like. So that's the way that the questions will be phrased, really limiting the choices so it becomes fairly obvious what we're going for here. About this piece, you could argue that both of these are landscapes with trees, ground, and sky. Little suggestion of hills in each one. So if I put these two side by side and I asked you which one was more naturalistic, I imagine you would pick this one. If I asked which was more abstract, I imagine you would pick this one. Now again, is this representational or not? Absolutely it is. It is representational. We can see trees, we can see mountains, we can see sky. But if I asked you with this one, is it naturalistic or very abstract? I think all of us would agree it has been altered significantly from what the real world looks like. This we could say is very abstract. Our theme could still be the natural world. It definitely doesn't feel like a religious or political theme here. The role of the artist, you could say they're recording the world. You could say that they're expressing emotion, probably, although we wouldn't all agree on the emotion. I think the best option here, if I were to give you a choice between, say, revealing the unknown or showing the world in an innovative way, if you just had those two choices for role of the artist, between the two, showing us the world in an innovative way, I think, is a more appropriate choice. They're not really revealing the unknown. We're not in a vision of heaven or hell or a monster no one has ever encountered before, but certainly the world looks different from what we expect. How about with this case? Is it representational? Absolutely, yes it is. Is it fairly naturalistic? Definitely. Things look like what they're meant to look like. The texture on the trees, the leaves are all very much how we expect the world to look like. If I asked for the theme here, and I limited the choices between daily life, imagination, and birth and death, I would say that looks like daily life. This is not a battle scene. This is not a political theme. It's not someone giving birth. It's not a funeral. It seems to be a street party, block party, essentially, is what you're seeing. They're peasants in a medieval village or an early Renaissance. That's exactly what you're seeing. About this piece, again, it's kind of old-fashioned, and the people look like how you expect people to look, so it's kind of similar to this one, but you automatically get a sense that this one has more of a political theme behind it. This is a battle scene. This is a general dying on a battlefield surrounded by his supporting troops. Very clearly, this one then would have a political theme. If I was to suggest that it was politics from the point of view of people supporting the power base, I think you could argue that definitely works in this case. The character of General Wolfe is presented almost like a saint, and he's being attended to by the people who very much are in support of his position. With this image, this is kind of an interesting one. This is the same artist who did the painting of the wedding with the woman in the green dress that we talked about earlier. This is a piece by Jan van Eyck, and it is a diptych, two-part panel. The first piece on the left depicts the crucifixion. On the right, we see Christ returning for the last judgment, and you see him taking souls up to heaven and casting some souls down to hell. If we zoom in on the hell section, you definitely can see that, yeah, this piece is representational. We can recognize things, people, skeleton, things from the real world. You could argue that it is definitely a religious theme, heaven and hell for sure, which would make your role of the artist, if I limited the choices to recording the world or revealing the unknown, he's showing us his vision of what hell might look like. That's something that we can't know directly, so definitely he's sharing with us something that is hopefully something we'll never experience directly ourselves, experiencing the unknown. This is kind of an interesting choice as well. This would be a great example of a religious theme. This is obviously meant to be the Garden of Eden, but it's interesting. I just did a quick Google search for paintings of this subject. Here's the same subject with completely different types of trees and animals, a completely different feeling by a completely different artist. So again, you could argue with religious-themed images that because we're not there to see these events directly, that an artist is having to somewhat use their imagination to depict them, and they're showing us something that we ourselves can't directly know in the here and now. This is a great example of a painting that people would probably have a hard time categorizing. Some people might argue this is non-objective because it's so strange, but you can clearly recognize the face, body, and hands, at least of this figure, even though it may take you some time to find the other ones. There are other suggestions of female figures here, here, here. They become kind of clear after a while. This will be representational, but if your choices were extremely naturalistic or extremely abstract, I think we would all pick the extremely abstract choice with this piece. With these two, same artist even, and within just a year or two of each other in terms of when they were painted, these are also pieces by Picasso. So if I were to ask you to pick between the two of them, are they both representational? For sure. Are they both somewhat abstract? I think you could argue even the one on the left is a little altered from reality. Certainly the one on the right is altered from reality. But if I ask you to pick which one is more abstract of those two, the one that conforms more to the proportions we expect is on the left. The one that's altered more from reality is the one on the right. Last thing, if we were looking at this piece, pretty hard to argue that that one is representing something that we can all agree on from the real world. This is a great example of a piece that would fit the non-objective category. All right, good luck with the test, and then we'll move on to Unit 2.